There is a goddess written out of history, not a minor deity from a forgotten culture, not a fringe figure from a text nobody read. A goddess whose name appears over 40 times in the Bible itself, almost always in the same breath as an order to destroy her, tear her down, burn what remained of her, and never speak of her again. Her name is Asherah, and for centuries, not decades, not a generation, but centuries, she stood inside the holiest building in Judaism. Her image carved and displayed in Solomon's own temple, in Jerusalem, beside the Ark of the Covenant itself. Women wove clothes for her in rooms adjacent to the sanctuary. Priests served her. Kings built her shrines. And then, sometime in the 7th century before Christ, a reform movement decided she had never belonged there. Her statues were pulled down. Her poles were burned. Her name was systematically removed from official records. What we're left with is what they couldn't quite erase. 40 references in a text that spent centuries trying to pretend she didn't exist. A handful of inscriptions on pottery and tomb walls, sitting in museums today, that tell a story the edited Bible doesn't. And one question that nobody in mainstream religion seems to want to answer directly. If the God of Israel had a wife, and the physical evidence strongly suggests he did, what does that mean for everything built on top of the claim that he never did? Tonight we're going to follow the evidence, not the theology, the evidence. Inscriptions, archaeology, the text of the Bible itself, read without the filter of what you've been told it says. Before we can understand what Asherah was doing in the Jerusalem temple, we need to understand who she was long before Israel existed as a nation. Because Asherah is not a Hebrew invention, she is not a local deity that one tribe in Canaan came up with and their neighbors copied. She is one of the oldest and most widely worshipped goddesses in the entire ancient world, and her story begins thousands of years before the first word of the Hebrew Bible was written down. In the Ugaritic texts, ancient religious documents discovered in 1929 at a site called Ras Shamra on the coast of modern Syria, dating to the late Bronze Age, roughly 1550 to 1200 BCE, Asherah appears under her oldest known name, Asherah. And in these texts, she is not a minor supporting figure. She is the primary consort of El, the chief god of the Canaanite pantheon, the father of all gods, the supreme divine patriarch. She is called in these texts the creatress of the gods. El is called creator. Together, they are the divine parents of the entire pantheon. Their children number 70 according to these texts, an entire generation of gods and goddesses born from their union. She is also called she who walks on the sea, Asherah of the sea, a title connecting her to the great primordial waters of creation. She is associated with lions, representing power, with serpents, representing healing and immortality, and most consistently, with sacred trees, date palms, terebinths, oaks, images of fertility and life that would follow her name all the way into the Hebrew Bible. Her reach was not limited to Canaan. In Akkadian texts from Mesopotamia, she appears as Asheratu. In Hittite writings, as Asherdu. In Babylonian contracts, she is called Ashratum is my mother. The Akkadian kings of the early 14th century BCE took the title Servant of Asherah. She had her own temple in Babylon. She was not one culture's local goddess. She was a pan-regional divine figure whose worship spanned the entire ancient Near East for millennia before Israel ever existed. And her consort, in every ancient context before the Israelites, was always El, the patriarch, the high god, the father. Now here's where this becomes important for everything that follows. If you've been following this channel, you already know that El, or El Elyon, the Most High, appears in the Hebrew Bible as a title for the supreme God, distinct from Jahwe in the oldest layers of the text. We covered the Deuteronomy 32 passage at length in our first documentary, the Dead Sea Scrolls version that shows el-Qom dividing nations among his sons, with Yahweh receiving Israel as his portion. In the original Canaanite religious framework that Israel inherited and transformed, El was at the top. Asherah was El's wife, and Yahweh was one of their sons, a member of the divine council, assigned to govern one people among many. Over centuries, as Israelite theology evolved toward the claim that Yahweh and El were the same being, something had to be done with Asherah. If Yahweh absorbed El's identity, he also inherited El's relationship with El's wife, which may be exactly how she ended up in his temple. Let's go to the text itself, because this is where most people are surprised to discover the evidence was never really hidden. Asherah's name appears in the Hebrew Bible approximately 40 times. In some older English translations, including the King James Version, her name was translated simply as grove or groves, which obscured what was actually being written. Modern scholarship recognizes the word as referring to the goddess herself, or to the sacred pole or living tree used as her cult symbol. The most significant biblical appearances fall into a consistent pattern, reforming kings or prophets ordering her worship destroyed, which tells us, without saying so directly, how widespread her worship actually was. Deuteronomy 16:21 has Yahweh commanding, "Do not set up any wooden Asherah pole beside the altar you build to the Lord your God." The fact that this command was necessary and repeated tells us the practice was common enough to require explicit prohibition. Judges 3:7 says the Israelites forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Asherahs, treating her worship as something that required specific, named condemnation alongside Baal, not as a vague or generic foreign practice. 1 Kings 18:19, in the famous confrontation on Mount Carmel, has Elijah challenging not only 450 prophets of Baal, but also 400 prophets of Asherah. 400 dedicated prophets. That is not a fringe cult. That is an established religious institution. But the most striking evidence, the detail that most clearly shows Asherah was not simply a foreign temptation that Israel flirted with and rejected, comes from three specific passages in the books of Kings. 2 Kings 21:7. King Manasseh, king of Judah, took a carved image of Asherah and placed it inside the temple of Yahweh in Jerusalem. Not in a pagan shrine, not in a foreign territory, in the Jerusalem temple, the holiest structure in all of Judaism. 2 Kings 23:6. King Josiah, the great reformer who came after Manasseh, removed the Asherah pole from the temple of the Lord, carried it out to the Kidron Valley, burned it, and ground it to powder. And 2 Kings 23:7. In the same reform, Josiah tore down the quarters of the male shrine prostitutes that were in the temple of the Lord, where women did weaving for Asherah. Read that last one again. Women, inside the temple of Yahweh, in dedicated rooms, weaving garments for Asherah. This is not a casual contamination. This is an established ritual practice, organized enough to have designated space within the temple complex, ongoing enough that a major royal reform campaign was required to dismantle it. For how long? The text implies centuries. Manasseh placed her image in the temple. His reign lasted 55 years, the longest of any king in Judah. Josiah removed her during his reform in roughly 621 BCE, decades after Manasseh. The text doesn't tell us she was removed and immediately restored. It implies she had been there, with interruptions and restorations, for the better part of the monarchic period. Now we leave the biblical text behind and go to something harder to argue with: physical objects dug out of the ground. In 1975 and 1976, archaeologist Zeev Mishal led excavations at a site in the northeastern Sinai desert called Kuntillet Ajrud. The site was a desert way station, a stopping point on ancient trade routes, attached to a small shrine, used by travelers and pilgrims during the 9th and 8th centuries BCE. What his team found there became, in his own words and those of his colleagues, one of the most widely discussed and controversial discoveries in the entire history of Israelite archaeology. On large storage jars, pithoi, they found inscriptions, Hebrew inscriptions, dedicatory blessing formulas, the kind travelers would write when asking for divine protection on a journey. And these blessing formulas paired two names together, again and again, in three separate inscriptions. I have blessed you by Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah. I bless you by Yahweh of Teman and by his Asherah. Give Yahweh of Teman and his Asherah. Yahweh of Teman and his Asherah favored. Four separate pairings across three inscriptions, written in Hebrew, at an Israelite shrine, in the 8th century BCE. And Kuntillet Ajrud was not alone. At another site, Khirbet el-Qom, near Hebron, in the biblical kingdom of Judah, a tomb inscription was discovered dating to approximately 750 BCE. Carved into a tomb wall, above a carved hand symbol, was this blessing. Blessed be Uriyahu by Yahweh, and by his Asherah. From his enemies he saved him. And the name appears again and again in the same inscription, by Yahweh and by his Asherah. A private person, having a blessing carved onto his own tomb, invoking both names as naturally as a single unit. Not one inscription, not one site, two sites, multiple inscriptions, the same formula, the same pairing, the same casual assumption that invoking Yahweh meant invoking both of them together. Beyond the inscriptions, Mishal's team at Kuntillet Ajrud recovered something else. Over 1,000 terracotta pillar figurines. Small clay figures of a female deity, the kind found throughout Judah in this period, made in vast quantities, used in domestic worship. These figures have been found not just at Kuntillet Ajrud, but throughout ancient Israel and Judah, in homes, in tombs, at shrines. They represent the single most common archaeological artifact of popular Israelite religious practice in the Iron Age. Scholars have debated whether these figurines represent Asherah specifically, or a more generic fertility goddess. But the pairing of the figurines with inscriptions explicitly mentioning Asherah at the same site is not coincidental. At this point, it's important to present the counter-argument honestly, because this is exactly what separates serious documentary content from lazy conspiracy content. And it also happens to make the overall case stronger, not weaker. There are scholars who push back on the Asherah as Yahweh's wife reading of these inscriptions, and their arguments deserve a fair hearing. The grammatical problem. In Hebrew, a personal name cannot take a possessive suffix. You cannot say, his Yahweh, or his David. Possessive suffixes attach to common nouns, not proper names. Some scholars argue this means Asherah in these inscriptions isn't functioning as a personal name at all. It's functioning as a common noun referring to the cult object, the sacred pole or living tree associated with Asherah worship. Under this reading, Yahweh and his Asherah means Yahweh and his sacred pole, not Yahweh and his goddess. This is a real grammatical argument, taken seriously by real scholars, and it cannot be dismissed. The counter to it. Even if Asherah here refers to the cult object rather than the goddess herself, the cult object was the physical representation of the goddess. You do not separate a deity's cultic symbol from the deity it represents and call it theologically neutral. A sacred pole of Asherah is not religiously equivalent to a parking sign. It is the visible embodiment of her presence. Blessing travelers by Yahweh and his sacred pole of Asherah is not meaningfully different in terms of what it implies about popular religious belief from blessing them by Yahweh and by Asherah. The broader, honest position. We cannot say with absolute certainty that ordinary Israelites in the 8th century BCE believed Asherah was literally married to Yahweh in the way a modern person would understand a marital relationship. What we can say with certainty is that invoking Yahweh and Asherah together as a paired unit in blessing formulas was common enough across multiple sites and multiple decades to be documented repeatedly, and that her physical symbol was present in the Jerusalem temple, by the Bible's own account, for much of the monarchic period. The evidence is real. The interpretation is genuinely debated. Both things are true simultaneously. Now here's the layer of this story that most people, even those who know the basic Asherah in the temple story, have never heard. And it changes everything about how you understand what happened to her. In the Ugaritic texts, Asherah's oldest documented context, her husband was never Yahweh. Her husband was El, the Most High, the patriarch of the divine council, the God above the gods. If you've watched our first documentary, you know exactly why that matters. We showed how the oldest Hebrew texts preserve a distinction between El-Elyon, the Most High, the Supreme God, and Yahweh, who appears in Deuteronomy 32 as one of El's sons, assigned Israel as his portion. Two separate beings, in the oldest layer of the tradition, later merged into one by the process of theological consolidation. Asherah was El's wife, not Yahweh's. So what happened when Israel merged El and Yahweh into a single God? Asherah got transferred along with him. She was El's consort in the original Canaanite framework. When Yahweh absorbed El's identity and titles, the Most High, the Creator, the Father, the Patriarch, he also absorbed El's family, including, apparently, his wife. This explains something that would otherwise be confusing. Why did Asherah end up associated with Yahweh specifically, and not with Baal or one of the other Canaanite gods? Because she was never primarily a consort of Baal. In the Ugaritic texts, Baal is actually her son, the stormy, active, younger warrior god to El's patriarchal authority. Asherah is the queen mother of the divine council, not a minor fertility goddess loosely attached to whatever local deity happened to be popular at the time. She came to Yahweh because Yahweh took her husband's place. And the people living through that theological transition, ordinary Israelites in the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, praying for safe journeys and carving blessings on tomb walls, simply carried the old partnership into the new framework because it had always been there. It was the reformers, the scribes, the later theological editors of the text we now call the Bible, who looked at that inherited partnership and decided it was a contamination, a foreign intrusion, a Canaanite corruption of pure Yahwehistic monotheism. But the evidence suggests it wasn't foreign at all. It was the original. So how do you erase a goddess? You don't announce it. You don't hold a public council and debate whether she existed. You do it gradually, across generations, through the slow accumulation of small decisions made by people with institutional power over what gets written down and what gets left out. The process in ancient Israel is actually well documented by scholars because the biblical text itself preserves traces of the editing. Like a palimpsest, a manuscript written over an older one, where the original text bleeds through the new layer if you look closely enough. The main mechanism was the Deuteronomistic reform. In the late 7th century BCE, during the reign of King Josiah, A reform movement took hold that scholars today call the Deuteronomistic tradition, a systematic effort to centralize all Israelite worship in Jerusalem, eliminate local shrines and high places, and consolidate religious practice around a stricter form of monotheism. The Book of Deuteronomy, as we have it, is widely considered by scholars to be a product of this reform period, not an ancient text from Moses' time as it presents itself. This reform movement produced a historical narrative, the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, that was written and edited with a specific theological agenda, to show that every time Israel suffered military defeat, exile, or political catastrophe, it was because they had worshipped other gods. Asherah, Baal, the Asherahs, the high places. Under this framework, centuries of what was actually mainstream Israelite religious practice, documented by archaeology, preserved in the inscriptions, implicit in the 40 biblical references, was retroactively reframed as constant, shameful apostasy. The ordinary Israelite farmer who kept a clay figurine of Asherah in his home, because that's what everyone had always done, wasn't practicing his traditional religion. He was sinning against a monotheistic standard that was, in many ways, only just then being codified in the form we now recognize. This is not fringe theory. It is mainstream biblical scholarship. The consensus among academic biblical scholars is that the Deuteronomistic history represents a late editorial layer, written with a specific theological agenda that reshaped earlier traditions significantly. What makes Asherah's case particularly striking is how completely the official record was changed, while the unofficial record, in the ground, in inscriptions on pottery and tomb walls, tells an entirely different story. Here's something remarkable. Even the text that was edited to remove her couldn't quite do the job completely, because some of what was preserved about Asherah wasn't recognized as being about Asherah at all by the editors who preserved it. One example, the title, Queen of Heaven. In Jeremiah 7:44, the prophet Jeremiah condemns the people of Judah for burning incense and pouring out drink offerings to the Queen of Heaven. The women of Jerusalem push back on him directly. They say their mothers and grandmothers and all the people of Judah had always offered to the Queen of Heaven, and that things had gone well when they did. They refuse to stop. Scholars debate exactly which goddess Queen of Heaven refers to. Some say Astarte, others Asherah. But the episode is remarkable for what it reveals about popular religious practice, independent of official theology. Ordinary Jewish women, in Jerusalem, in Jeremiah's own time, openly defending the worship of a goddess as legitimate tradition. And they're not describing something new. They're describing what their mothers and grandmothers did. Another example, more subtle, Proverbs 8. In this passage, wisdom, personified as female, speaks in the first person. She says she was present at creation, beside the Creator, a master craftsman, delighting him daily. She calls people to herself. She offers life, favor, and blessing. Biblical scholars have long noted the striking parallels between this personified wisdom and Asherah, the mother goddess, the creatress, the consort of the divine creator. Some have argued that wisdom in Proverbs 8 is essentially Asherah, absorbed into the tradition in a theologically safe form, stripped of her name and her explicit divine status, but carrying her essential role, the feminine divine principle beside the masculine creator God. Whether or not that specific identification holds, the broader point stands. Traces of a divine feminine presence survived in the Hebrew Bible precisely because they were embedded in forms that the editors didn't recognize as Asherah, or considered theologically safe enough to preserve. Let's go back to archaeology for a moment, because there's one category of evidence we haven't fully explored yet, and it's the most physically widespread of all: the pillar figurines. These small terracotta figures, typically a few inches tall, depicting a female form with emphasized breasts, often with the lower body forming a simple pillar or column base, have been found throughout ancient Israel and Judah in extraordinary quantities. In homes, in tombs, at shrines, in the ruins of ordinary households. They are by far the most common religious artifact of Iron Age Israel. Thousands of them have been recovered from archaeological sites across the region. For a long time, official archaeology was reluctant to identify them directly as Asherah, partly because of the grammatical argument about the inscriptions, and partly because acknowledging them as images of a goddess worshipped by ordinary Israelites was theologically uncomfortable for a field that was, for much of its history, deeply intertwined with biblical scholarship conducted by religious institutions. But over the past several decades, the scholarly consensus has shifted. These figurines, found in ordinary Israelite and Judean homes across the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, represent popular domestic religious practice that existed entirely independently of whatever the official temple theology in Jerusalem was saying. Ordinary Israelite women kept images of a goddess in their homes. The same period, the same region, the same culture that produced the Hebrew Bible. That's not a foreign contamination. That's not an import from Canaanite neighbors down the road. Those figurines were made by Israelites, kept by Israelites, buried with Israelites when they died. The official religion said one thing, the lived religion of ordinary people said another, and the ground remembers what the official records tried to forget. This part of the story is harder to document archaeologically, because it's about absence rather than presence, about what a religious tradition looks like when half the human experience is stripped out of its understanding of the divine. In the Canaanite framework that Israel inherited, the divine was structured in pairs: El and Asherah, the creator and the creatress, the patriarch and the matriarch, heaven and sea, father and mother. Not because ancient people were naive about theology, but because the pairing reflected something intuitive about how the world actually works, that creation requires both principles, that the universe has both a structuring force and a nurturing force, and that a religion which honors only one of them is, at some level, describing only half of reality. When the reformers removed Asherah, they didn't just remove a goddess. They removed the entire concept of a divine feminine from the tradition. They left a God who is always referred to with masculine pronouns, always described in relational terms borrowed from human patriarchy: king, lord, father, master, and systematically eliminated every figure, title, and concept that had previously balanced that framing. The traces that survived, personified wisdom in Proverbs, the mysterious feminine presence of the Shekinah in later Jewish mysticism, the elevated role of Mary in Catholic tradition, each of them, in different ways, represent an attempt to recover what was lost. An intuition, recurring across centuries and theological traditions, that something was missing. Some scholars have argued that the removal of Asherah is not simply a matter of ancient religious politics. It had lasting consequences for how the three Abrahamic traditions that descended from ancient Israelite religion understood gender, the body, nature, and the relationship between the human and the divine. That's a much larger argument than we can fully make here tonight, but it's worth sitting with. As we've done in every documentary on this channel, we end with honesty about what the evidence actually establishes and what it doesn't. Why the core case is well-founded. The inscriptions are real. They are physical objects, datable, sitting in museums, examined by scholars across the world for 50 years. Their content is not in serious dispute, only their interpretation. The biblical passages are real. 40 references, including the explicit placement of Asherah's image in the Jerusalem temple and the presence of weavers making her garments inside the temple complex, by the Bible's own account. The pillar figurines are real, thousands of them, from ordinary Israelite homes, representing domestic religious practice that clearly existed independently of official theology. And the Ugaritic texts establishing Asherah as El's consort predate the Hebrew Bible by centuries and are unambiguous. None of this is manufactured. None of it is conspiracy. It is documented, peer-reviewed, debated, and taken seriously by scholars with no religious agenda to push in either direction. Why the interpretation should be held carefully. The grammatical argument about the possessive suffix is real and unresolved. We cannot say with certainty that his Asherah in the inscriptions means Yahweh had a literal divine consort, rather than a sacred cult object associated with her worship. The pillar figurines are widespread, but their identification as specifically Asherah, rather than a generic fertility goddess, is still debated. And the broader picture, that Asherah was the original wife of El, who was transferred to Yahweh when the two gods were merged, while compelling and well argued by serious scholars, remains a reconstruction of a process we can't directly observe, rather than a documented fact. The honest bottom line. Something happened in ancient Israelite religion involving a goddess named Asherah, and it was significant enough to require 40 biblical prohibitions, a royal reform campaign, the destruction of her temple installations, and the careful editing of a national historical narrative. Whatever exactly that something was, whether she was understood as a literal divine consort, a cultic symbol, or something in between, she was real, she was present, and she was systematically removed. The religion that came out the other side was different from the religion that went in, and the removal was deliberate. We began tonight with a question. If the God of Israel had a wife, what does that mean for everything built on top of the claim that he never did? We followed the evidence across Canaanite mythology and Ugaritic texts, across inscriptions on pottery and tomb walls, across the words of the Bible itself, and across the physical remains of a goddess whose clay image was kept in the homes of ordinary people for centuries after her official erasure. What the evidence shows is not that mainstream religion is lying. It's that the version of ancient Israelite religion that became Judaism, Christianity, and ultimately Islam was not the only version that existed. It was the version that won. The version whose scribes and reformers and editors controlled what was written down, what was preserved, and what was described as having always been true. The other version, the one with the goddess in the temple, the blessings invoking both names, the clay figures in the homes of ordinary people, that version didn't disappear. It went underground. It survived in traces. In 40 verses that couldn't quite be removed, in the feminine face of wisdom in Proverbs, in inscriptions on pottery jars left behind in a desert way station by travelers who saw nothing unusual about invoking both names at once. Asherah was never fully erased. She was just buried, and the ground remembers.